All right, we're going to get started. We are going to talk about the top 5 Agile pain points that lots of organizations encounter that have been doing Agile either for a brief amount of time or a long amount of time. All right, so my name is Nick Kramer, and I work for WebAge Services as their Agile coach and trainer, one of their Agile coaches and trainers. On the screen here, I've given you my name, my email address, and my Skype address. If you should wish to get a hold of me for any particular reason, have questions, have comments, like some follow-on information, hit me up at one of these two locations, and I will be happy to help you and assist you in any way that I possibly can. At the end of this seminar, I'll also give you another email address to send a note to somebody if you would like a copy of this presentation. So here we go. So for this particular question, if you have any questions or comments, just raise your hand and I will be happy to raise them or put them in the Q&A chat and we will go from there. At the end of the session, I'll open up if I can figure out how to unmute everybody, I will open it up for comments at the end. So when I was putting together this presentation, I originally had said that I wanted to do 5 pain points, which I'm going to do today. However, when I started putting the deck and materials together, I realized that for a 50-minute webinar, I have like 5 hours worth of content here. So I'm going to go over them quite briefly. And then at the end of this session, I'm going to ask for a poll to see what other pain points you have. And if we have a lot of interest in certain ones of these topics, maybe we'll do a full training, half-day training or something on one of the topics in greater detail. So first of all, I wanted to put this little slide up here on why lots of organizations initially fail. I find actually that I'm not going to turn everybody on here so you can talk. There we go. There's 6 of us. And I'm curious then, what are the other reasons that you're aware of that projects fail, or why do projects fail at your organizations? If anybody would like to speak up, you might be muted, so you have to unmute yourself. Anybody have any thoughts? All right, interrupt me if you have some. The first pain point that when I work with organizations, I hear a lot about is silos still exist and that they are having a difficult time creating cross-functional teams. So when we talk about in terms of Agile, right, as you're probably aware, because I'm sure many of you are Agile experts, an Agile team should be self-organized and empowered. It should be cross-functional. It should be accountable, and it should be small. It is my experience that organizations generally create teams around, they take their waterfall process, design team, coding team, QA team, and they take members of certain ones of these teams, they combine them together so that they have all the skill sets necessary to create a cross-functional team. Then they form their teams as cross-functional. However, this is sometimes not always the best approach, and it can leave things out which causes the cross-functional teams to not exist and can actually create a different set of silos than you may have had before. So we're really sometimes just flopping from one type of silo to another. So remember, teams should be self-organized, right? They should know and solve their own problems, which means they have to have all the skills and all the skill sets are readily available to them in order to solve those problems. The minute a team has to reach outside of itself to solve a problem or to write pieces of code or um, to perform certain tasks, then they are no longer self-organized and they're definitely not cross-functional. So again, like I said just a moment ago, we create another silo. So you can see here that the way we used to do teams is we would have certain skill sets that development, certain teams that did QA, certain teams that did integration. So in a waterfall process, we would, the requirements people would do their work, hand it off to the developers, hand it off to the QA people, and then maybe to the integration testers. Well, in order to form a truly cross-functional team, we actually need to create teams across boundaries. And these, of course, are just samples of the different skills or the different teams that we may have encountered before. However, one of the issues that I see that is one of the most common problems is that organizations, when they initially start to create their teams, they take a couple developers, a couple testers, and a couple other people, and they stick them together, and they say, well, you guys are now a cross-functional team working on XYZ product. And that works really great, but then what happens is they say, but if you want to do, say, some database work, or you want to have some UI UX work done, then you need to add that work to the backlog of the other team that is the UX team or the database team. So then they create hard dependencies. So the team is working along, they discover they need some database work, so then they have to put it on the database team's backlog, and then the database team gets to it when they get to it, which means now this team has a dependency on another team to get their work done. So now things are delayed because we're waiting for the other team. It takes a lot of coordination. Scrum masters have to work together. We have difficulties understanding who product owner and product management is. And then once the DBA team gets their work done, they hand off that work back to the development team, and the development team continues to work, and back and forth, because of course nothing ever works right the first time. That's just how development works. So now we create even additional dependencies or additional silos across teams because we didn't initially set up a cross-functional team with all the skills necessary to complete their tasks. All right, you got some, just one moment. We got some people joining. I'm going to turn them on so that they can join us on the talking part if you'd like to. All right, does this sound familiar? And please speak up in the middle of the webinar here or type something in the comments, but does this seem like this is something that your organization goes through? Just swapping one type of silo for another. All right. Well, there is a solution for this problem. And what it is it takes a little bit of time, and it takes a little bit of practice, and it takes a lot of patience, and it takes definitely some management buy-in to solve the problem. And the technique that I prefer to use is to do value stream analysis. So what we should do is we should sit down as an organization and we should figure out what our operational value streams are, right? What it takes to actually get things done from an operational standpoint. Then we identify all the systems that it would take to support those operations. And then we create a development value stream about what does it take to actually implement these systems across the operational value stream. Now, as you can see in this picture, which I have borrowed from a SAFe implementation, we take these three kind of swim lanes here, and now we can start to divide them up by systems, by development value streams, and by operational value streams. And we determine all of the people that would be involved with creating, maintaining, and updating a particular system or value stream. Once we have that in place, we can then determine all the skill sets that are needed across the value stream to support a particular team or system in order to create value for the organization. In this way, we are directly attaching the operational value stream and the development value stream together, and we can build teams that can support both. And we build cross-functional teams that have all the resources necessary to support those. So by sitting down and taking a step back, we can see all the people that would be involved, and then we can assign those people to the team. There are other advantages to doing value streams first before establishing teams, or when you're going to reevaluate teams. They are first, if you can figure out what the operational value stream is, you may be able to identify waste in the process or places that you can improve the operations of the business side of your organization. Being able to make these things more efficient and more effective can definitely make things better and cheaper, and and you can increase customer value. Then, by identifying your development processes across there, you can determine who is needed to support those value streams. So this is a technique that I always recommend that organizations go from when they need to identify who should be on a team. Now, the question I get a lot is, but what if my team doesn't need a full-time DBA? Well, in that case, I would recommend that you really look at the teams on how they're made up and assign the DBAs to a cross-functional team where they're definitely needed the entire time. And then it is possible to create like a shared resource pool and have people sit on multiple teams and share responsibilities across multiple teams. But at least now you're only coordinating with one individual to get their work done, rather than whole teams of work or whole silos to reduce the handoffs that you would have seen before. Okay, I'm sorry I keep flipping back forward to this view, but I'm checking the comments part here and I can't seem to do it when I'm in the presentation mode. All right. Now, like I said before, this is a safe approach, which is a scaled agile approach, but I actually use it all the time. I learned this when I did some safe training, and I use it all the time. I was just in New York this last week working with an organization and helping them identify their teams using value streams. And it actually turned out very valuable because it created knowledge between the business side and the technology side. The business side figured out what it took to actually maintain the systems they used. And the technology team learned about how the business truly operates in ways that they didn't understand before. And then they can build systems now that are more effective across the organization. So that's pain point one that I see a lot, is organizations are changing or moving their silos from old waterfall silos into new agile silos, which of course is not agile at all. So I would recommend that this is one of the first places you look if you are struggling in agile, is do you have the correct teams and the correct skills on your team in order to be truly cross-functional. All right. Pain point number two that I see is requirements and user stories. A lot of organizations are telling me that we used to gather requirements and they were so good when we did waterfall. They were so lengthy and they had so much detail. And now we go to this new user story format and it's just a few sentences and it doesn't make sense. And we just can't develop off just a few sentences. Well, of course, that's not the way Agile is meant to be worked, or Scrum, whichever framework you're using. So there's a misunderstanding a lot between the proper way to write user requirements. All right, so the first thing we should talk about is probably, if you're new to Agile, is what is a user story? And of course, a user story is a definition, it's a requirement, it's a piece of functionality that you would like the development team to tackle. Um, a more common approach to think about user stories is they are problems that you would like your teams to solve, right? And there are usually 4 steps it takes to identify a user story. You first should define the end user. Then you should specify what you want or what the problem is that you're trying to solve. The third step would be then to describe the benefit if we solve this problem. And then lastly, we add acceptance criteria. How will we know when we successfully solve this problem? Okay. All 4 of these steps are key. If we don't know who we're solving a problem for or who the end user is, we generally have a tendency not to create the correct solution, or we make it more complex or not complex enough. So understanding the user is important. Then we need the development team to understand what the user is trying to do and why they are trying to do it. And then we have to understand, of course, how do we know when that's done? All right. When you're writing user stories, if you wanted to have a quick checklist or something to say, how do I know whether my user stories are good? These are 6 kind of things that I always look for. Does it bring the users closer? Is it bringing the development team and the customer people together so that we all understand the issue, the problem? Number 2, is it a building block of the product? Are we adding incremental value to our products? Does it boost transparency? Each story should help you understand what's going on along all levels of the value chain. It should help us to determine then what is our highest value delivery object that we should be doing, which one will return the best investment, which one will create the highest benefit. It should foster collaboration across all value streams. And of course, like we talked about when you do value streams, it should create some shared understanding. The more shared understanding you have between everybody involved in the value chain, the value stream, the better products that we can build that actually solve real problems. All right. Now, the first tip that I would like to give, because user stories, of course, are very complex and very difficult to write. The first tip I would like to give you, since this is a short webinar, is I would always consider writing a definition of ready. A definition of ready is an agreement between the product owner and the team that says the product owner will provide his user story or requirement in a certain level of detail before the team will consider working on it. And on this next slide here, I give some examples of, what the team might have said should be in their definition of ready. They have to have a good user story, maybe with some decent acceptance criteria. It should have been estimated and prioritized. They would require mock-ups, maybe SME contacts, right? They can UI, UX diagrams, ER diagrams. It's whatever the team would need as a blanket checklist to say, Mr. Product Owner, we will tackle this story on the first day of our sprint if you provide this level of detail. This avoids causing the product owners to bring stories to the team that are incomplete, and then the team then just has to spin their wheels on trying to execute on. This way, they have at least a pretty good understanding of what they're building before they start. Now, likewise, my second tip is that each organization should come up with a definition of done. A definition of done, similar to the definition of ready, is a contract between the product owner and the team, saying when the team gets done with a particular story, it will meet a certain level of completeness in order for the product owner to start looking at it. This avoids the product owner spending time testing and reviewing stories that are not up to standard. And some examples that I've given here is, the code might have to have been checked into the repository. Maybe you've done a code review with the team. Documentation is complete, that you've passed all your acceptance criteria. right? Maybe your automated tests have passed, the product owners looked at it. These two definitions are very important to help bookend to create proper user stories that have the right level of detail that avoids churn. The next thing that I hear often then is, well, we don't know how to write user stories because we don't want to write too much information up front that's unusable, and we don't want to provide too little detail. We just don't know the timing of it. And so I would recommend that each organization create something like this. This is an example of how you would expect a story to look at kind of each phase in the life cycle of a story. And for example, this is one that I helped an organization with recently. They had 4 levels that they were working through. The first level was a high-level feature kind of a thing at the product backlog level. And this company said about 4 months ahead of time, when we're talking about features, these are the definition of ready to be able to consider it to be a feature in the product backlog. Then when they got, say, 3 to 6 sprints ahead of development, they would call that the release backlog. And that now we're starting to break stories into stories and epics. And this organization said, in order for it to be on the release backlog, it needs to meet this definition of ready here. And then when we move it to just before we start working 2 to 4 sprints ahead, and now it's a complete user story, it needs to meet this definition of ready. And then finally, just before the team starts on the sprint, it would meet this definition of ready. You'll also notice then across the bottom here, they also said which types of roles would be involved in each level of the user story experience. That way, they were involving the right people at the right time, and that the team could stay as focused as they needed to be on the objectives at hand, but yet they were providing the necessary information and knowledge they had in order to help the product owners and the stakeholders to write those stories. So my third tip on writing user stories would be, of course, create some sort of framework. So tip 1 would be define a definition of ready. Tip 2 would be define a definition of done. And then tip 3 would be to create some sort of timeline or framework on how you're applying those definition of readies across these stories and features. All right. Oh boy, half hour goes by fast. My third pain point that I hear a lot is, besides the user stories, and let's say maybe we get the user stories working correctly, then organizations generally move on to, we can't seem to test. We can't seem to get our testing done correctly. We're spending too much time at the end of the sprint doing testing. All of our stories are failing and bleeding over into the next sprint so we can complete the testing there. We're having difficulties creating automated testing. And so the approach that we generally like for organizations to consider taking is consider taking a test-driven development approach first. And that would mean that you should learn how to write your tests more effectively up front. So test-driven development generally means that on step 1 here, we write our tests, and then we run our tests, and of course our tests are going to fail because there's no code or functionality. Then we write our code, run our tests to make sure it passes, and then we make any refactoring changes that we may need. Now, the advantage to creating the tests first is the developers know exactly what they're going to be testing on, and they will code to exactly that amount of specification, no more and no less. Then, if the developers make changes to their code and they need to refine the code or add additional functionality, now they have a good set of test bed that they can run every single time they start touching that piece of functionality. So if they refactor the code, all they have to do is run these tests again, and we know it should work, and on and on. This takes a very disciplined approach in order to learn how to do test-driven development. along with test-driven development, or a form of test-driven development, I would recommend is behavior-driven development. And behavior-driven development is writing tests from a user perspective on how they are going to use the application. So actually write tests assuming that you are a user. So there's test-driven development for the coding side, which we just discussed, and then there's behavior-driven tests on how a user would use the system. And a great example that I like to give on behavior-driven tests is let's make the assumption that you're testing an ATM machine, right? If the coders are going to test, they're going to test things to say, well, make sure they have the right amount of money, make sure that they put the correct PIN number in, make sure that that the PIN number is, that the card is not expired. But behavior-driven tests take a slightly different approach. You walk through the steps that a user would be. So behavior-driven would be, I walk up to the machine, I insert my card, I enter my PIN number of 456, I request to remove money from a checking account, I enter $100, I press enter, the machine dispenses $100 and dispenses my card. The advantages of doing behavior-driven tests is now we can discover what's important to the user, and we can make sure, first and foremost, that user functionality is working correctly, and it creates a good test bed to make sure that we are providing the value that we should be providing to the customers, rather than providing logical steps which the TDD will cover. We're actually making sure we're covering the value. So this is kind of a cultural shift, just like a lot of other things, learning how to implement TDD and BDD, because you're going to want to start thinking in terms of behaviors and driving expected behavior, rather than focusing so much on checklists and verification of steps in a coding process. So I would highly recommend that if you've never done behavior-driven development, that you give it a whirl. It's a way of thinking of reframing your tests. Now, about a month ago, I did a half-day free class on behavior-driven development and on how you can switch. It's in our archive at webagesolutions.com. If you'd like to check it out, I believe we had almost 100 people that sat through the class, so you might find some value there. And then next month, at the end of the month in November, the last Thursday of the month, I believe, we're providing another training on how to automate what we learned in the first steps using tools like Cucumber and Selenium. So we will learn how to do browser testing and how we can save those browser tests in order to run them over and over again. Now, if your organization doesn't necessarily do browser testing, you can use the same technologies for database testing, API testing, and lots of other testing. So I would encourage you to check out the free class that we offered last month and to join us for our next free class at the end of November. All right, so we're about 3 steps in here, and I was going to add this as my 6th pain point, but I'm just going to tack it on as a solution for the first 3 pain points. And that is, does your organization actually have a journey and a roadmap? Are you actually planning out how you're going to implement Agile, how you're going to stand up new teams? Having a plan is key. Just sending some people to training and then setting them in a room and say, all right, now you're Agile and go for it, it is just not a successful way to launch Agile. So I would always say, definitely consider having a roadmap. And this is a sample roadmap that I recently created for a company that I did an Agile Kickstart program for. So it gives you an idea. Of course, you can download this in the presentation materials, to figure out maybe some steps that you would take to kickstart your Agile journey. Now, this also applies if you're doing moving on to the next level. Let's say you want to teach your teams how to do test-driven development and behavior-driven development, you're also going to probably want a very similar plan to this. You're going to want to have a strategic plan that outlines how are you going to get there and what are your objectives. You almost always want to train your leadership on what it is that you're about to kick off, because they are key in helping organizations succeed and helping teams work better together. You're then definitely going to want to train your teams, whether that's actual formalized training or hands-on training, or just giving them some books and videos and having them get started. But you're going to need some sort of training program. And then you're probably going to want to pilot that program to make sure that it works correctly, see what you can learn, inspect and adapt, and then launch that into additional teams. So I just wanted to get you these kind of 4 or 5 high-level steps so you can build your own plans potentially to kickstart your next initiative. All right. Now, one of the biggest pain points that I'm seeing lately is companies will call me and they'll say, Nick, we've been doing Agile for a while. We think our user stories are pretty good. We could probably do a little better on TDD and behavior-driven development, but we just can't seem to get better or faster. Our code is buggy, and we're just not seeing the value that we expected. Nearly always, once we do a deep dive and do a little organizational assessment, we find that it's because we're doing a pretty good job on those things we talked about before, requirements gathering and testing, but we've yet to identify or help the developers get any better. Now, learning about engineering skills on how to be a better developer, a better automated tester, can be very complicated. There are a whole slew of different things that subject matter places that you could do training, right? Are you doing design thinking organization? Are you helping your developers to think on better ways to solve problems? Are you doing lean startup concepts? Are you doing inspection and adapting, building things, testing out on your customers to make sure that they work? Are you doing Agile properly? And are you doing continuous adaptation? Are you doing DevOps? Now, you don't have to do all 4 of these kind of cycles together, but it's important to identify your organization's strategic plans and then pick and choose the correct one of these or all of them that you need to implement in your organization, and then to teach your developers, your engineers, your testers how to appropriately work through these, right? The way I like to think about this is, for those of you that were mainframe developers, you can't just skip over and now all of a sudden learn how to do C# development. It's a whole different mindset. It's the same is true when we say we're going from an old version of project management to, say, Agile. It's just such a completely different, more modern concept that we need to do a little upskilling. So it takes a little bit of work to make a mind shift. Just to kind of a little side note here, I was watching a documentary the other day about when cars first came out. People had a very difficult time driving cars because they would be driving their cars and then pretty soon the road would turn and they would drive off into the ditch. So they couldn't figure out, the user couldn't figure out how to make the shift from a horse to a car. And it turns out it's because horses, when they come to a curve in the road, they automatically generally kind of follow the road. So they would actually curve for you. And people then expected the cars to do the same thing. They expected to curve around the corner. And when they didn't, of course, the end result was disastrous. And the same kind of thing I was thinking about applies to switching to an Agile or a new framework, right? We expect teams to do something different, but using the old skill set. So we're definitely going to want to get them some training. And of course, I can spend, months and months, and this isn't necessarily, I don't want this to be a sales webinar, but you, again, just like we talked about before, you're going to want to build a plan and talk about how you're going to upskill your engineers. And my only cautionary plan, this is a plan that I put together for an organization is that it's not something that can be generally done overnight. It takes time, it takes patience, and it takes a lot of practice to make this work. So when implementing a plan to do engineer upskills, uh, definitely keep those things in mind. So again, if you ask for this presentation or download it, which is in the notes section, you can take a look at this. And of course, I'm always willing to help. All right. My final pain point that I get from a lot of organizations in my last 5 or 10 minutes here is Agile isn't going to work for us because we're just too big. We have too many large projects. It takes too many people to get this project done. We just can't figure out how to get our teams down to 3 to 5 teams. People, I mean, it's just not going to work. So I hear this constantly, right? We're just too big to do Agile. We're not a startup. We're an old school organization. And everything that they say is true if you use the paradigms, if you're not willing to make the shift. But fortunately, there are some great scaling frameworks out there that help organizations that have extraordinary circumstances. And some of those might be, you might want to consider building a scaling framework if you have very large programs or portfolios. If you have very complex environments that revolve around lots of collaborations across many business units or many subject matters, you may want to consider scaling, right? If you have low productivity and quality of your current teams because of handoffs and silos, poor requirements, TDD and BDD, then you may want to consider scaling. And also, if you currently have a centralized decision-making process that makes all the decisions and they're very slow to react, it's very difficult to get decisions to be made. So you need to push those decisions, or you're wanting to push those decisions down to the groups of people that should be making them, then a scaling framework may be for you. There are, several different ways that you can scale. You could scale based on your product. Maybe your organization sells or has many different products that they're looking to scale around. Maybe you have some platforms, multiple teams working on the same platform type product. Maybe you have horizontal by business unit that you need to scale, or maybe it's vertical by chain of command. I would definitely look at all of these different factors when looking at scaling. Now, again, doing some high-level value stream mappings and that kind of thing might help you identify which way you want to scale. Now, one of the scaling frameworks that I am most familiar with is SAFe. SAFe is one of the more popular ones. It is very successful because it prescribes and teaches your organization how to solve these large scaling problems throughout the organizations. They have processes and frameworks built for not only team levels of work, project levels of work, portfolio levels of work, all solutions level, management level. This is just one little diagram that they have for more of the product level. So I would recommend if you're interested in that. But I also added another slide here that there are many other different scaling frameworks. I mentioned SAFe. There's LESS, which is another great one. Large scale Scrum. There's DAD, Disciplined Agile Delivery. There's one called Leading Agile, Nexus, and of course there are just dozens of these. And so if your organization is questioning if they want to go a scaled framework, I would do a little research, check these out, maybe have some experts come in and talk to you about them, because there are advantages and disadvantages to all of them. And in the end, you might decide that you're going to pick and choose. You're going to take some ideas from SAFe and some ideas from LESS and merge them together to create a custom framework, which of course, since we're trying to be agile, is perfectly acceptable. Don't let an organization or a sales group tell you that they can't do that, because it's definitely not true. I am a big fan of both SAFe and LESS, and I generally merge lots of stuff together when we're talking about both of those. right. So to recap, we had 5 pain points that we were talking about this week. We're talking about silos, right? And ways of breaking down silos. My tip there would be to do some value stream analysis. The second pain point that I see a lot is poor requirements. And in that particular case, I would look at the 3 things: the definition of ready, the definition of done, and creating a framework for requirements, definitions of ready. The third thing that I've seen here is testing. My tip here is to consider doing test-driven development and behavior-driven development. Engineering skills, my tip here would be to take your value stream maps that you've created and determine which of those programs might make sense to you: design thinking, lean startup, agile, and DevOps. And then finally, for scaling, determine how you would like to scale and why you need to scale. And then, of course, reach out and get a little research. So in November, we're running the other half of the behavior-driven development. Look for that. It's on our website. And in December, the first part of December, we are going to give an overview on what design thinking is. Design thinking is kind of the new and upcoming thing that we're working on in the space. It's a great way to learn how to solve problems for lots of different reasons. And I'd encourage you to check it out. It'll be very interesting. I am not doing that one. Somebody else from our organization is, and I'm actually going to join because I'm interested to learn more about design thinking myself. So